Welcome to the Jeremiah Patterson Show, and thank you for joining me tonight. We have a special guest coming up, Mr. Ronald B. He's a national security and foreign policy expert. He not only has decades of experience, but also a unique diplomatic perspective on all that is happening right now. So stay tuned for that interview coming up in just a moment. But before we get to that, I do want to start at the outset with some history here because it's worth noting what exactly we are up against and what exactly we can sort of look back to in the past to understand this current moment. It was after World War One, on June 28th, 1919, that all the major world powers met in Versailles, located in France, to sign the Treaty of Versailles. And the Allied powers had won the war, and this treaty was essentially a peace agreement to make sure that we would never have to do something like that again, where hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of men are on the front line dying. So the nation of Germany was held responsible for the starting the war and the received harsh consequences for it. This treaty included Germany losing territory, paying millions of dollars in reparations to the Allied powers, and also demilitarization. And this wasn't something that the US president, Woodrow Wilson, was particularly proud of because he wanted peace without victory. This should be a war to end all wars. And Wilson did not stop there. He was very much an advocate for world peace and noted essentially that after the war, if we wanted to prevent a major world conflict like this again, we needed to create something. We needed to create a military alliance, some foreign alliance to make sure that we are bulletproof, prepared, and able to defend ourselves more aggressively and strategically the next time something like this happens. We need to be more coordinated. I mean, just think about how long it took for the United States to join World War One. So World War One starts in 1914. The United States did not join the war until 1917 because of an ideology called isolationism. Oh, they're going after all those countries. At least it's not us. We can sit this one out. Isolationism only works if the perceived geopolitical threat doesn't become expansionistic, doesn't become too optimistic about going into other countries. It only works if the problem does not arrive on your porch. And lo and behold, do you think that worked for long? Staying out of it? Apparently not, because one day the United States woke up, walked outside the house, and not even on the porch, but you could just see the threat an ocean away, which was considerably way too close for comfort. Germany was participating at the time in submarine warfare, essentially attacking and torpedoing ships. And one of the ships that was attacked was one of our allies, Great Britain. And it was traveling from New York to Liverpool. There were over 1,900 people aboard that ship. All of them died, including 123 Americans, when the ship was torpedoed and sunken by a Germany U-boat. And that's when the United States effectively said, we had enough. It ended its isolationism stance and effectively joined the front lines of the war. So isolationism does not work for long. It's only a matter of time before the problem that you are watching, persist around the world is going to come to you. You yourself are not immune from that global threat. We tried America first before in this country many times. It's not what you think it means if you look at the history of that movement, but it's failed each time. In order to truly succeed as a nation, you need to work with others. You cannot operate as your own individual entity. And Wilson understood that. So after Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles, he continued to champion the League of Nations, which would be essentially the first multinational diplomatic group where you would have multiple nations in favor of maintaining world peace. And so, in the end, although the League of Nations had been formed, it did not last, specifically because Congress didn't give Wilson the votes for the United States to join. And on top of that, most of Americans still believed that we should isolate and not get involved in European affairs. Have we learned nothing, folks? I mean, isolating and watching as the problem metastasizes is exactly what got us here. Doing nothing will bring us back here again. And sure enough, it happened. In 1936, Adolf Hitler of Germany sent German troops into a territory that Germany had lost in the Treaty of Versailles called Rhineland, where part of that agreement included no military presence in Rhineland. And Hitler said, screw that, I'm going in. It was a direct violation of the treaty and was organized immediately. It was essentially recognized immediately. Was he punished for it, though? No. He felt emboldened to go further since he wasn't punished. The West and the failed League of Nations aren't going to hold me accountable for what I just did. Okay, then I'll just go invade another country. Next up on the list was Austria. Send in the German troops. And again, there was a stark absence of dominance from the West. Maybe if we just let him have Austria, he'll be satisfied. He won't do anything else. It's just two countries. What can hurt about that? Turns out that didn't work. He wanted more. And this time, the West was here to help by flat out just giving him another nation. Britain and France at the Munich Conference in 1938 pursued a policy of appeasement. If we give you this country, no more, okay? No more invading other nations, Hitler. No more aggression. And so he held off for a while. And a few months later, Hitler breaks the agreement and goes after Czechoslovakia and then Poland, which Britain and France had promised to protect. And it was at this point that it was that serious that Germany was going to be an existential threat to the modern political world, that they were going to be an existential geopolitical threat. And it was 2 days after that that Great Britain declared war on Germany, effectively having other Allied powers join in as well, declaring World War II. You see how all of this could have been prevented? Because they did not stop him at the outset, he felt emboldened and he felt bulletproof to continue going further with further aggression. To any country that stood up to him, he was going to come after you next. He was going to take whatever he wanted. And France, one of the major superpowers of the Allied powers, was targeted. They too were invaded. Great Britain was next on that list, very, very close to the United States, until essentially that German operation was canceled to invade Great Britain. Hitler invaded a total of 27 countries, acquiring them, essentially holding them as territories of Germany effectively. It wasn't just about power in terms of him becoming a dictator, but it was also about him becoming an expansionist dictator. Global domination, global power. Let's kick the United States and the pro-democracy movement off of the face of the earth. Dictatorships are going to be the new movement. That's what Hitler was trying to achieve. And a total of 27 countries, including the dictatorship, the Soviet Union, which he had promised Stalin that he would not invade and then went in anyway. And his justification for invading all these nations was not only for global domination, but also specifically because he believed that there was German blood, innocent Germans living in those countries that needed to be saved from the Jews, that needed to be saved from the too idealistic, optimistic, poisonous thinking of pro-democracy from the West. Come back to the homeland. It was that type of nationalistic rhetoric that perpetuated and fueled the rise to power for Adolf Hitler. It's why the Holocaust happened. And it's why he violated multiple treaties and felt emboldened and strong. And ultimately, after the United States joined the war, the Allied powers started closing in on Germany and got so close that Hitler, he knew that he wasn't going to win, that the West was closing in and that he was outnumbered. So he committed suicide by shooting himself in the head, which ended the war. And there were many celebrations that it was over. But it was also around that same time that the United States and the Allied powers discovered the horrific atrocities of the Nazi concentration camps, where Jews and others were viciously slaughtered, starved, and treated in such inhumane ways that it is almost inconceivable to talk about. And it was only this time, after World War II, after the invasion of multiple nations, after the invasion of 27 countries, after 75 million people died on the battle lines, it was only this time that the Allied powers seriously realized that we need to create a coordinated diplomatic peace group and military alliance to ensure that we really, really do not let this happen again. And this time, the United States, you need to be a part of it. You're a major superpower. And so this gave birth to the United Nations, which of course was founded in San Francisco. They had their big meeting there. And also NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The UN was formed to maintain global peace and security, and NATO was founded to protect each other from threats, invasions, or military aggression. Never again should this happen. If you allow an expansionistic dictator to feel emboldened after they invade one country, what makes you think they won't go after you next? What makes you think they won't stop? It was a test. Let me just take a little bit of this country and see how the West reacts. Okay, crickets. Well, let me just go take some more. Still nothing? Okay, let me just take the whole country. Oh, that's when the real opposition kind of says something. They don't act, they just say words, condemnation statements. Then you get appeasement. Maybe if we just give him this one piece of land, he'll stop, he'll hold off. But if we punish him, he'll be more aggressive. I mean, we don't really want to get involved in a war, do we? That kind of cautious, naive, weak minded thinking is not only complicit in the falling of other countries, but it also shows the expansionist dictator what is possible, how far they can go. And even if they go far enough, they can go further because no one will dare to stop them. And if someone tries, well, you're weak because you didn't stop me the first time. You were silent in the beginning, therefore you're complicit. I'm going to take your country too. You don't matter. In the 1990s, the Soviet Union fell, and all of its territories were formed into different nations. It was a major event at the time because it broke in the United States here on Christmas Day in this country, and it was a major, major event. I mean, the United States having to contend with all these new countries that formed after the Soviet Union just fell. And among the newly formed nations was Ukraine. So Ukraine gains its independence from the old Soviet Union, and so did the newly formed nation of Georgia. It was, about 8 years after that, in 1999, that a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin became the prime minister of Russia, and he did not share the same views as Boris Yeltsin, Russia's president who ended the Soviet Union. Putin believed that Yeltsin was weak and that we should never have done that. We should still be the Soviet Union. And a year later, he became president of Russia and served till 2008, eventually, proverbially, ripping up the Russian constitution and was like, you know what? I want to be president longer. And so he becomes a dictator. And as president of the country of Russia, one of his long quests is to rebuild the old Soviet Union and go further and further. In 2008, Putin invaded the nation of Georgia, falsely accusing them of committing genocide against native Russians and harming the native Russians. And they need to be saved to memorialize the history of Mother Russia. Does that sound familiar? And there was relatively no major pushback from the international landscape from the West. So that was Putin's green light to do it again. And 8 years later, he sure did. He went after Ukraine this time. He annexed Crimea, and still to this day, it is occupied. And this time, there was more of an international pushback from the West. Russia was kicked out of the G8, making it the G7. It's an exclusive multinational group of nations focused on political and economic affairs, also in protecting democracy and peace and freedom worldwide. The nations included are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the United States. And in addition to kicking Russia out of this exclusive club, the US also pledged $1 billion in aid to Ukraine, and the European Deterrence Initiative was founded by the help of the Obama administration to, quote, reassure our allies of our solemn commitment to their security and territorial integrity as members of the NATO alliance. It is a necessary and appropriate show of support to our allies who are now deeply concerned by Russia's occupation and attempted annexation of Crimea and other provocative actions in Ukraine. The United States stands by its allies as they have stood by us. It should be noted that Barack Obama was not particularly fond of Putin. That's clearly seen in this famous picture here. But all these things were basically done to show Ukraine that we stand with you. We are standing in solidarity with you, along with putting sanctions on Russia. But even that wasn't strong enough. I mean, Putin still sort of kind of felt emboldened. He still illegally occupied a piece of Ukraine in addition to occupying 20% of Georgia that he illegally invaded back in 2008. And when Donald Trump became president, it wasn't just clear over time, but it was clear essentially from the outset that he was compromised by Russia. After the US intelligence community unanimously concluded that Russia interfered in our elections, Trump then disputed that after meeting with Putin. But Trump Russia relations go all the way back to the 1980s, essentially with business deals. I mean, this is something that the Trump family has been open about. This is something that was investigated by Robert Mueller, the special counsel, looking into Trump Russia ties regarding around the 2016 presidential election. But it's something that goes far, far back. And when you look at that in regard to Ukraine, it's even more concerning because Ukraine being protected and shielded from Russia's aggression when Donald Trump becomes president is now more uncertain because he's not just, pro Russia, but he's also pro dictatorship. I mean, he's expressed his love and admiration for these men on your screen. Viktor Orban of Hungary, of North Korea's dictator Kim Jong Un, Javier Milei was invited to his inauguration. Javier Milei has instituted Project 2025 in his country. I mean, all of these people, including Putin himself and other dictators that Trump praises and admires, is even more concerning when you talk about Ukraine because that leaves the possibility of the United States defending them. It makes it uncertain. And in 2019, when Donald Trump was president, on a phone call with the new president of Ukraine, the newly elected president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, he said essentially, if you announce an investigation into the Bidens, because Joe Biden is most likely to be my political rival for the Democratic side in 2020, I will give you the Javelin missiles that you need to continue to fight off the Russians that are trying to take your country completely. And you might remember that Donald Trump was impeached for that. It was a quid pro quo. And yet again, inviting a foreign country to interfere with our elections, but also pressuring a foreign country that needs critical military defense support in order to stay a sovereign, independent nation, pro-democratic and free of Putin's dictatorship. You are pressing our ally to be corrupt. This is a Republican talking point that they've been pointing since 2019 that Ukraine is this big corrupt nation. Yet we're the country asking the Ukrainians to announce an investigation into a political rival that we do not like because we think that that person is most likely to be our victor, is most likely to be our contender in the next presidential election. But yeah, Ukraine's the corrupt one. Putin only held off for so long. His aggression and his persistence for global dominance did not wait. In 2022, he launched a full-scale invasion into the nation, and ever since then, the United States has been supporting the country with defense missiles, foreign aid, and continued support. When Joe Biden was president, you might remember that he supported Ukraine in multiple ways, sending billions of dollars in aid, defense support, and inviting the president and the ambassador of Ukraine to attend the State of the Union, including this iconic picture with Vice President Kamala Harris and Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, standing behind him in support, praising his leadership and his valor on the front lines. And oh, by the way, the reason he's always in plain clothes when he speaks to foreign countries and when he meets with foreign officials is because unlike other cowardice leaders who would leave their people, Volodymyr Zelensky, since the very beginning, has been on the front lines in the streets, talking with his people and helping defend the nation and the country that he loves against an expansionist dictator who seeks to take it. What happened yesterday in the Oval Office in terms of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance berating and gaslighting the president of Ukraine was absolutely despicable. It was reprehensible. It was not diplomatic. It was full-on bullying. It was vitriolic rhetoric, accusing him of not being thankful enough. You ought to be thankful that we're sending you Javelin missiles. Otherwise, your country would be gone. And we're not going to play that here on the Jeremiah Patterson Show. We're not going to play that because it's truly repulsive. If you want to watch it, it's fully available on YouTube to watch. Check it out if you can even stomach that. but I'm quite sure you've seen it by now, which is why you're probably watching the show. And that type of rhetoric, that type of incendiary remarks to the president of Ukraine presents a very horrific possibility here that the United States has joined the side of the Axis powers. That the United States effectively is stepping away, reducing its role here in terms of 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 diplomacy, but also globalism and stepping back. And it's not something that's quite surprising because this was specifically talked about in Project 2025, which is Donald Trump's agenda for his second administration. This is from Project 2025 here. Quote, another school of conservative thought denies that U.S. Ukrainian support is the national security interest of America at all. Ukraine is not a member of the NATO alliance and is one of the most corrupt nations in the region. European nations directly affected by the conflict should aid in the defense of Ukraine, but the U.S. should not continue its involvement. This viewpoint desires a swift end to the conflict through a negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia. So, what Project 2025 is calling for there effectively is for us not just to step away in terms of supporting Ukraine financially and militarily, but it's also saying we should just not be involved in this at all. And what that looked like in real life, playing in effect, was the president of the United States and the vice president of the United States berating the Ukrainian leader and siding with an expansionist dictator. Think about how horrific that is. That the United States in the year of 2025 is arguing on the side of North Korea and China and Russia and all the dictatorships in the world. We're arguing on that side. This is more from Project 2025. Quote, the next administration must end blind support for international organizations. If an international organization is ineffective or does not support Americans, the United States should not support it. So that looks like stepping away from globalism. So what does that look like? If NATO does not support or is effective to American interest, we're going to leave NATO. We're going to leave the G7. I mean, what have they done in terms of stepping away from globalism right now? We've left the World Health Organization. We're ending US aid. So that's going to have cascading effects in terms of infectious diseases rising exponentially across the world. That's going to have devastating effects for lots and lots of things. We're going to have special reporting on that coming up later this week. We've left the United Nations Human Rights Council. What else is next that we're going to be leaving in terms of stepping away from globalism? I mean, the threat of expansionist dictators is growing because it's not just Putin and Russia that's going to go after Ukraine. It's going to be, China that wants to go after Taiwan. Expansionist dictators are a thing in 2025, and it's a very, very much a very serious existential threat. And in regard to Ukraine, this is something that Vice President Kamala Harris talked about specifically during the campaign trail during the first debate between her and Donald Trump. Watch.
I believe the reason that Donald Trump says that this war would be over within 24 hours is because he would just give it up. And that's not who we are as Americans. Let's understand what happened here. I actually met with Zelensky a few days before Russia invaded, tried through force to change territorial boundaries, to defy one of the most important international rules and norms, which is the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I met with President Zelensky. I shared with him American intelligence about how he could defend himself. Days later, I went to NATO's eastern flank, to Poland and Romania. And through the work that I and others did, we brought 50 countries together to support Ukraine in its righteous defense. And because of our support, because of the air defense, the ammunition, the artillery, the javelins, the Abrams tanks that we have provided, Ukraine stands as an independent and free country. If Donald Trump were president, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv right now. And understand what that would mean, because Putin's agenda is not just about Ukraine. Understand why the European allies and our NATO allies are so thankful that you are no longer president, and that we understand the importance of the greatest military alliance the world has ever known, which is NATO, and what we have done to preserve the ability of Zelensky and the Ukrainians to fight for their independence. Otherwise, Putin would be sitting in Kyiv with his eyes on the rest of Europe, starting with Poland. And why don't you tell the 800,000 Polish Americans right here in Pennsylvania how quickly you would give up for the sake of favor and what you think is a friendship with what is known to be a dictator who would eat you for lunch.
Once again, that was Vice President of the United States at the time, Kamala Harris, speaking about the fact that world leaders are so grateful that Donald Trump is no longer president because of the way that he views things, the way that he is in so much favor to dictators, but the dictators are easily able to manipulate him. All it takes is to favor Donald Trump, to flatter him, and you've got him. Capitulated just like that. When it comes to a moment like this in the United States, it is to be understandable. It is to be clear-eyed about the fact that we do not have a person in the Oval Office, an administration that is, in effect, strong, that is, in effect, dominant in regard to protecting the United States' interest and also our allies' interest as well. Donald Trump has literally talked about invading our NATO allies, invading Greenland and taking it, invading the nation of Canada and taking it, joking about Canada being the 51st state. The United States being on the side of the Axis powers in 2025 is something that probably was not on your bingo card. But if you did read Project 2025, it was clear that this was coming. The ambush, in effect, was planned. And for this to happen on national TV, for Vladimir Putin to see that, it's a clear indication that the United States is in the position to give up Ukraine, and that Putin will go further, potentially even into a NATO country like Poland, as Vice President Kamala Harris said there, which would in effect begin an all-out war. Because with NATO, an attack on one is an attack on all. Article 5 of NATO. And looking at this, I do just want to say one more thing, because this is also quite concerning in terms of the way Republicans and Trump are looking at this, and also stomach turning, is the fact that Republicans can't even say if Russia invaded Ukraine. I mean, this was Democratic Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett essentially berating, excoriating Republicans for saying Russia invaded Ukraine. Just say that. The truth matters. Did Russia invade Ukraine? So I'm going to play this, and then it's going to be followed by Senator Tammy Duckworth on Congress in the Senate, essentially asking Trump's nominee to be the Deputy Secretary of Defense, did Russia invade Ukraine? And this is something that they continue to struggle with, and they can't give a definitive answer on.
It is time for us to say, Mr. President, guess what? Russia invaded Ukraine. Can we at least agree on that one? Facts matter. Y'all, this is literally potentially putting us into an international crisis. We may be heading towards the next world war because we have a president that wants to pal around with Putin and wants to do everything to make him feel good, including lying about who invaded who. Mr. Chair, I got a minute left, but I really want to yield to any of my colleagues and ask them if they will say today, very basically, that when it came down to the war in Ukraine, that it was not Ukraine that invaded Russia, it was the other way around.
Can you tell me if Russia invaded Ukraine? Mr. Feinberg? I mean, Mr. Hexet said it.
Yeah, I understand.
It's easy, yes or no. Did they invade Ukraine?
I don't feel that I should publicly comment in the middle of a tense negotiation when I'm not privy to the facts to undermine what potentially.
You're not privy to the fact whether or not Russia invaded Ukraine and started a war that's lasted for 3 years?
I'm not privy to the details of what's going on in the negotiation between Russia and Ukraine, what the sensitivities are, what the president's trying to accomplish. So I'd be afraid to speak out of turn and undermine that. I do have confidence the president is very skillful. That he's the first guy that brought Russia to the table.
The president is kneeling down to Vladimir Putin. I cannot believe the commander-in-chief of the greatest military on the face of the earth in my lifetime is bowing down to Russia.
This is a major, major crisis right now. And it's one that's horrific. It's one that's frightening. And it's one that does require kind of a deeper perspective to understand. And as democracies are facing far-right governments right now, rising all across the world, and dictatorships are rising, and dictators joining together and laughing at the United States falling and being glad about that, because that means the United States would join the side of the Axis powers. You also have moments like this, where there is resistance in the streets in the nation of Georgia, saying, no, we will not ever be part of the old Soviet Union. We will not be taken fully, completely by Russia. Resistance and shows and signs of support like this, where all the world leaders, many of the world leaders today stood in stark defiance of what Donald Trump and J.D. Vance did yesterday, saying that we love you, Ukraine. We stand with you, Ukraine. I mean, this was just today in Great Britain. I mean, all of the world, most of the world leaders, including in NATO and other countries, saying that we stand with Ukraine, we will defend you, we will be with you. At the same time, our president here is berating the Ukrainian president for what he is doing to defend his country against a hostile, expansionistic dictatorship. Think about that for a second. All the other countries in the world, all the major allied powers are saying, we stand with Ukraine, we will support you, we will continue to help you. But the United States is on the other side of that coin. The way we're talking is we're talking about it essentially like the Axis powers would want us to talk about it. That is something to be concerned about. That is something to be horrified about. And that is something to watch for. Because we're actually stepping away from globalism here. And that's not just going to not be good for Ukraine. That's not going to be good for any of us. And that's something that we should watch for, but also ask questions about. Ronald B., my guest, he joins me next, a national security and foreign policy expert. Stay with us. After 9/11, Ronald B. appeared on multiple news networks and radio stations as a national security expert on wide-ranging topics. He has an educational background in international affairs, diplomatic history, and has held more careers than you can count on one hand. Mr. B was a public affairs analyst at the International Atomic Energy Agency. He worked on projects conducted for the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and he's even served on the Presidential Commission for Chemical Warfare. He is currently incredibly well-versed when it comes to all things geopolitics, and he's, very perspicacious and just the person you want to talk to in a moment like this. Joining me now for the interview is Ronald B. He's a national security and foreign policy expert. Mr. B, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate you taking the time to do this.
To you, Jeremiah.
So, yesterday, Ukraine's president, Zelensky, was in the Oval Office, and he was effectively berated by the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, as well as Donald Trump. It sort of became like this tense, argumentative situation where they are effectively accusing him of not being thankful enough or, hateful of Vladimir Putin. And I wanted to get your take on this in regard to this being a time where the Ukrainians are actually trying to get a peace deal, not just with the United States, but also other NATO countries to ensure that, Russia does not go further in fully taking the country. What does this mean in terms of the possibility of those negotiations, but also what does this mean for NATO?
Very good question, and it's my first reaction, and I said this yesterday on the news as well, is that it's very unusual to see name calling in front of the cameras, and it's very undiplomatic. That if you're going to have a direct conversation like that, it's usually best in private. And I've done negotiations in the Middle East where it's even more important to keep things private. But so I thought it was unfortunate that that dirty laundry was aired in front of the cameras. There was probably other dirty laundry that has been discussed with Vladimir Putin, but wasn't in front of the cameras. But since we didn't see that, it came across that he was siding with Vladimir Putin. The problem with being a mediator, and that's what President Trump is trying to do here, is that you're not supposed to take sides, and you're not supposed to name blame, and you're not supposed to call anybody names, because it's not about the individuals, it's about their country's interests. And so from a diplomatic perspective, yesterday was very unusual, and I would say unfortunate, because if the true goal is to achieve peace in the region, which I think both sides need, both Ukraine and Russia, where there's now over 1 million dead and wounded, and we don't know the numbers exactly because both sides are being coy about casualties. That's over a 3-year period. Those are World War I numbers, like Verdun. They are feeding their soldiers into a wood chipper, both sides. We have spent a lot of money in support of Ukraine, which is the right thing to do, through NATO, and NATO has spent a lot of money to support Vladimir Zelensky and Ukraine. We've spent somewhere over $100 billion. And for a new administration coming in, trying to cut the budget and balance the budget, that's a lot of money. And if the war would come to the end, it would be less expensive for us as well. So both sides need to negotiate a peace. Yesterday was just a blip on the radar screen, as far as I'm concerned, as someone who's been involved in diplomacy. But from here on out, I would conduct it more privately rather than in front of the cameras.
With regard to Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and then again in 2022, and then also going back to the invasion of Georgia in 2008, are you concerned here, or just looking at this from your perspective as, also a foreign policy analyst as well, are you concerned that Putin would go further in looking at other countries, such as going into Poland, which would invoke Article 5 with NATO?
Yeah, I think he would avoid going into NATO states, because then you're facing the alliance, and the alliance has 3 nuclear weapon states in it: the United States, France, and the United Kingdom. I think it would be more likely that he would go into a place like Moldova, a former Soviet socialist republic that is also has a number of Russian speakers in it, and the northern part of Moldova wanted to separate from the southern part, which is close to Romania, and so you could take advantage of that, and that's been under discussion for a while. But I think he would stay away from NATO because of the very fact that you're then facing the United States straight up. Because under the alliance, it's a 3 Musketeers alliance, all for one, one for all. So if one's attacked, everybody has to come to their aid.
Yeah.
And in fact, the whole debate over NATO membership is probably the real reason why Putin invaded in the first place. They have 1,200 miles of shared border, Russia and Ukraine. First of all, he didn't want to see Nutella on that border because this all started, as you may recall, over a trade agreement with the European Union. And if the European Union's going to make Ukraine a member, that soon NATO would come soon thereafter on the defense side. So he didn't want to see either Nutello or NATO troops along that 1,200-mile border. And of course, Russia, if you've done your homework, the name Russia comes from something called the Kievan Rus, which is part of Ukraine, and so Russians feel a certain cultural heritage, if not association with Ukraine from the get-go. And things, of course, have changed over time, and Ukraine wants to be more Western. I had a student who was in Kiev when the revolution took place, and she was in charge of the press, and she had 2 dead Ukrainian students shot by Russian special forces under her desk while she was conducting interviews. So I know people that are involved. I know refugees that have come from Ukraine. I was offered a job in Ukraine at the end of the Cold War to run the Freedom Support Program, so I have a special affinity for it. But I also understand the geopolitical implications of Vladimir Putin trying to take it over.
With regard to Ukraine right now, in terms of their persistence to get a peace agreement and a peace treaty conducted here,
When you say
but also
there, who do you mean? Who do you mean there?
Ukraine individually,
Okay.
and the president there, Volodymyr Zelensky. I'm interested in hearing your take on if there are concerns that the nation could fully be, fully annexed completely by Russia.
Well, yeah, yes, that's that would take that annexation would require the annexation by force, and under current conditions, I don't think that's going to happen. About 20% of Ukraine is under contention in terms of the actual landmass. You have Donetsk, you have Lugansk in eastern Ukraine, and you have Crimea, which is also a very important warm water naval base for Russia in the south. And that's why they went in 2014 to secure that naval base, which has traditionally been in Sebastopol, and Russian Navy's been there for a long time. And they're all Russian speakers. So they annexed that first, and without much pushback from either Ukraine or the West. And so 8 years later, I think they moved on Lugansk and Donetsk when invited by the separatists to come in and assist them. And that war has gone on for 3 years with, as we've mentioned already, over 1 million casualties, and with no end in sight. So it's not a bad idea to have negotiations. There were negotiations before the war started that could have turned out differently, but didn't. And Putin took advantage of the situation when he was invited in, and it's created the bloody mess that we see on our screens every night.
The United States, under the current administration, has moved to step away from globalism in regard to the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Accord, the UN Human Rights Council. Is it concerning to think of the United States stepping away potentially from NATO or like the G7? Is that something that would be concerning, and how would that change the balance of power on a global level?
Yeah, it would turn things upside down. Actually, I don't think we will ever leave the G7, because that's an economic forum, and the one thing that the Trump administration cares about is economics of the United States, and you can't play in that game if you're not part of it. And so the G7 is a very important international organization that where we can go and negotiate trade deals, and not just trade deals, but on the sidelines they talk about foreign affairs and defense policy. So NATO, we were a founding member in 1949, and Europe needs our not only our financial support to run it, but our military might, including the ultimate guarantee of our nuclear arsenal. I doubt that we will leave it. There are always threats to do it because of Europeans not paying enough money. We call it the burden sharing issue. And whether it be Democratic or Republican administrations, that's been a complaint for a long time. I remember President Obama and his administration complaining about the lack of European burden sharing when it comes to NATO. But we're still better off with NATO than without it, and so I don't think we'll leave that. The other organizations you mentioned, UN Human Rights Council, the World Health Organization, and such, even the UN itself, that's a different ballgame. We, of course, the UN started with a declaration in San Francisco in 1945, and it's based in New York for a reason, because the idea was an American one that came from Franklin Roosevelt as a follow-on to the League of Nations, which was also an American idea by Woodrow Wilson, that got shot down by the U.S. Senate. About 35% of the country is what some people call isolationists. I would call neutralists, namely because if you're in isolation, you don't trade. But trade has always been an integral part of the country since George Washington, who was the one who came out in his farewell address to say, avoid entangling alliances. And that tradition is still on the left and the right United States, and a great many of Americans think that we spend too much money overseas and not enough at home. President Obama, as I remember, said that we should nation build at home and not overseas. And so in that way, Trump is suggesting that he wants to nation build at home and not overseas and not spend as much money. Now, that can easily be misconstrued as that we're not interested in international relations whatsoever or international organizations. But I think it's a posture and not a possibility.
Once again, this is my interview with Mr. Ronald B. He is a national security and foreign policy expert. Thank you so much for coming on the show and giving your perspective. Just invaluable as always.
Happy to be with you, and thank you for inviting me. It's cool to be on air with someone in Texas where I have relatives.